why it seems so odd that people ever played them. That's the introductory slide. That's me, that's the company. And this is a picture of a stone carving of the Mesoamerican ball game that someone tried to draw a sort of an interpretation of up the top. We're running a bit short of time, so I'm just going to keep talking through all of the games that I find interesting from history until I run out of time. And the Mesoamerican ball game is A, one of my favourites, and B, one of the very, very oldest. In fact, it's the longest continually played game in the world. First games of this type were played in around 1400 BCE, and there's still versions of them being played now. And it's a really, really, really ridiculous, incredibly seriously taken ball game where teams of 2 to 4 people wear stone belts and use them to hit a rubber ball that weighs up to 10 pounds through some goals that look like this. You can see an enthusiastic tourist there who's fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the game. He doesn't get to use his hands, he gets to hit them with his hips, protected by a stone or leather belt, so the bruising is only occasionally fatal. And it's a game that was not just really, really widely played, but also taken incredibly seriously. It appears in one of the most important texts of the period, stories of origin and creation and how things got to be how they are, in which a couple of people go down and play the Lords of the Underworld at this ball game and lose because the Lords of the Underworld cleverly cheat. They use their ball, which is called White Dagger, and which is a round knife covered with bones to make it smooth. If you're not immortal and you try to play a ball game with a round knife, it turns out you die. But then, about 20 years later, the sons of one of the dead players discovered what had happened and challenged the Lords of Chivalba, the Lords of the Underworld, to a rematch and went down there to try to get vengeance for what had happened. And it's described in immense detail in one of the longest texts remaining from the period, all about how they bicker with the Lords of the Underworld about which ball they're going to use and which rules they're going to play by. There's a bit where the Lords of the Underworld go, "Let us play ball then," and the boys go, "Good, here is our ball, here is ours. Not your ball, but our ball must we use." "Fine." "It is a decorated ball." "No, it is a skull." "No, it is not." And they play with the ball, which turns out to indeed be a skull and be full of all sorts of traps. And so then the boys have a huff. They refuse to stop playing. The Lords of Chivalba eventually say, "Fine, fine, we'll use your ball." They have an enormous match which involves the boys enlisting a rabbit to help and replacing a decapitated head with a marrow and then playing with the marrow for a while. And through some sort of intense trickery, they eventually beat the Lords of the Underworld and have avenged their fathers, and they return to the world. And the fact that the game took such an enormous place in the mythology of the period and the time isn't in isolation. It also, in the actual real world, had political importance. There's loads of evidence that political disputes were sometimes settled through games of this ball game. So in areas where there's lots of political discord historically, there's more ball courts, because people think you had to have more ball games in order to settle these disputes, and in some cases figure out who got to rule over a particular piece of land purely by dint of who won at the game, which is wonderful and peculiar and makes this, I think, probably one of my favourite 3 weird games from history ever. Rhythmomachia is another of them. Rhythmomachia comes later in around the 1100s, 1200s, medieval Europe, and it's one of the most ludicrously complicated board games. At the time, it was played more seriously in some places than chess. It was taught in universities and treated with this immense attention, and it's just ridiculous. So you can slightly see here some of the layout. So 2 sides, asymmetrical sides, had pieces. The pieces come in 3 different shapes. The 3 different shapes all move differently, and also the shapes have numbers on them, different numbers for each side. This is a version of it that someone made and sold through Kickstarter. You can see there's lots of different shapes, lots of different numbers, and also a stack of lots of different ones all put together, which is called the pyramid. And the way you play is it's like chess. It's a two-player open information abstract strategy game, but there's 7 different ways to take opposing pieces, of which the simplest is, if the space between your piece and their piece has a number in it such that if you multiply that number by their piece or your piece, you get your piece or their piece, then you can take their piece. It gets more complicated from there. There's also many, many different ways to win, which you agree on in advance. So you can win until people have taken a certain number of pieces, you can play until people have taken a certain value of pieces, or you can go for the major victory, which is if you're playing really, really seriously. What happens is you have to dismantle their pyramid, which is a pile of pieces that can move like any of the pieces within it, and take opposing pieces like any of the pieces in it, or any sum of the pieces within it. You have to dismantle it entirely, take all of the pieces of that, and then you've got to set up 3 of your pieces on their half of the board, it's an 8x16 board, such that they're evenly spaced from each other and form an arithmetic, geometric or harmonic progression amongst the numbers. And if you want the super, super, super brilliant victory, you want it to be arithmetic, geometric and harmonic, made out of 4 that you split into a group. It's absolutely almost unplayably ridiculous. I've given it a few games and it's not even fun. But it had a position of immense respect, partly because it was seen as being so intense and good for the brain and educational, as it were. The first English language version of the rules came in, I think, 1400, 1500. It was written by a guy called William Falk, and he published it with a big poem at the start explaining why it was so great. He opens by claiming it is noble and learned, called the philosopher's game, and intended for the honest recreation of students and other sober persons. He tells a story of its origins. Pythagoras did first invent this play, as it is thought, and thereby after studies great his recreation sought. Pythagoras did not invent this game. Most games and plays abused are, and few do now remain in good and godly order as they ought to be, certain. For why? All games should recreate the heavy mind of man, and eke the body overlaid with cares and troubles then. But now, instead of pleasant mirth, great passions do arise. Instead of recreation now, revengings we practise. Instead of love and amity, long discords do appear. Instead of truth and quietness, great oaths and lies we hear. Instead of friendship, falsehood now mixed with cruel hate, we find to be in play and games which daily cause debate. Pythagoras, therefore, I say, to make redress herein, invented first this godly game, thereby to fly from sin. So it was both, difficult to the point where you could put a load of attention in it and get really, really good at it if you wanted, and feel pleased with yourself for playing it. But also it was respectable. It was a thing that it was okay to want to play, which is particularly important in an era when one of the other popular games was door breaking. There's a story that Peter Ackroyd likes to tell in almost all of his histories of England where he can fit it in, because it's amazing, about a game that apprentices would play in the 12th century, which was called Breaking in Doors with Our Heads. No one really knows what the rules are, but to some extent we can assume that it's self-explanatory. And then jump forward to the Victorian era and talk a little bit about parlour games, which are super, super, super weird. The Victorians were really, really weird. There's the gathering of people in an evening to play nice games and do charades and so on, something that we still get in fictional portrayals of the Victorians a lot. But if you actually look at the specifics of the games they played, they include a game called Poor Pussy, where everyone would sit in a circle and one person would be nominated the cat and would crawl around and go up to someone and meow pitifully. If the cat meowed at you pitifully, you had to pat it on the head and say "poor pussy" 3 times without smiling. If you smiled, it was your turn to take over as the cat. It just went on and on and on. There's a lot of these games about not smiling or not laughing. And there's also a surprising number about making animal noises. So there's one called Squeak Piggy, Squeak, or Squeal Piggy, Squeal, depending on which book you're reading, where one person would be blindfolded and sit in the middle of the room. Everyone else would go and sit around them. The person who was blindfolded would be given a pillow. They would crawl over to the circle, place the pillow on the lap of the first person they found, sit on it, and say, "Squeak, piggy, squeak." And the person whose lap they'd sat on would squeak like a pig. And the person who was blindfolded had to guess who it was. And if they guessed correctly, they won. And if they guessed incorrectly, they lost. Blindfolding, also super popular. There's Are You There, Moriarty, which is obviously later Victorian, which is one person is Holmes, one person is Moriarty. You blindfold yourselves, you lie on the ground. The person who is Holmes has a rolled-up newspaper and says, "Are you there, Moriarty?" Moriarty says yes, and Holmes tries to hit Moriarty on the head with a newspaper. There's Snapdragon, which is a Christmas game, which is a game where you put some brandy in a dish, you put some raisins and some coins in the brandy, and then you set a light to it, and you take it in turns to try to get something out. A delicious raisin, which if you eat it really quickly probably won't burn you, or tuppence, which is worth money but will, actually sear your fingers. And How, Why, When and Where, which is a game where you choose a secret object, say a microphone, and everyone has to try to guess what it is by asking you the 4 questions: how do you like it, why do you like it, when do you like it, and where do you like it? And you'd answer those questions honestly and then try to guess what the object is. So there's lots of deeply, deeply peculiar games. And then, at the end of the games, it gets even weirder, because then it's time for the forfeits. Every time you lose a game, you hand over some sort of object to represent that you've lost the game. Then, at the end, in order to get those objects back, you have to perform forfeits for each of them. And they're mostly about kissing. So there's one where the forfeit to be paid is you have to go and kiss the 4 corners of the room, but then, 4 burly Victorian gentlemen go and stand in the corners and look smug. So there's a thing of kissing as punishment, but there's also a thing of being denied kissing as punishment, because one of the other forfeits that would be paid by a woman, they're usually gender-specific forfeits, is that you would lead another woman around the room and introduce her to all of the gentlemen, and they would kiss her instead of you. So because you lost the game, this denial of kisses is what you have to put up with in order to get your objects back. And it's obviously the sort of excuse for touching as a game thing, the same sort of Twister and Fingal and all of that sort of stuff, but just in massive, massive dresses. Lobby Lud is from the 20s. Lobby Lud is amazing. This is a game that was played by having a copy of the newspaper and wandering around town looking for a guy called Lobby Lud. This is where I am X and I claim my £5 comes from. So there was a newspaper, I think it was the Westminster Gazette, I think it was in the 20s, I might be wrong on either or both of those, who began a promotion called Lobby Lud, and they put a picture of Lobby Lud in the newspaper and say where he was going to be. And if you walked up to him and correctly identified him while holding a copy of the newspaper, then you got £5, which is quite a lot of money at the time. And it became so enormously popular that they had to put on special trains to the places where Lobby Lud was going to be appearing. And Lobby Lud was once in Richmond Park, and 50,000 people turned up. Men who looked a bit like Lobby Lud were trapped in phone boxes, waiting for everyone to go away. And it's not me, desperately trying to get rid of them. And I have about a minute left, so I'm going to finish off by describing Split the Kipper, which is a 1960s playground game played in England and parts of Scotland, which is played with firm shoes and knives. So you stand opposite each other, you're probably about 9 or 10. It's in a recess break. This comes up in the Iona and Peter Opie's book about playground games, and it's described to them by a boy who says, "This is a quick game, so it's a good game for recess and other short breaks." One of you takes the penknife and throws it at the feet of the other, but not to hit, but to land within about a foot. If it lands within a foot, that player has to move their foot out to where it is, pick the knife up and throw it back. If the knife lands too far away, or if it doesn't stick in the ground, it doesn't count. So gradually you're moving your feet further and further apart and still throwing the knife back and forth. And if you fall over, you lose. That obviously gets difficult, so if you want to bring your legs back together, you can aim the knife between the legs of the other person, yelling "Split the Kipper," and if you get that, you're allowed to bring your feet back together. In the Scottish version of the game, after you've had one round, you play another round backwards. And I'm out of time. Thank you.